My name is Dave Nave. Russell Ackoff brought new insights into managing the interactions between the parts of a company rather than managing the behavior of each part individually. He called this approach systems thinking, and his insights are a tremendous contribution to business and society. On behalf of the Deming Cooperative, we are pleased to make these videos available to you for your continued learning.
The last topic I want to discuss that was on that list of changes that have to be made was a change in corporate planning. It's absolutely central. There are three dominant ways of approaching planning that are in use traditionally, and they're shown on this simple table, which makes clear the essential differences. What I call reactive planning is the type of planning that tries to reconstruct a previous state, to go back to a past that was better than the present, and they think that things are getting worse, and so they idealize the past. And I'll give you some examples. That's the reactionary in politics. The conservative is inactive, trying to preserve the current state of affairs because they say they're well enough, good enough. Don't rock the boat, let nature take its course, let well enough alone. That's all keeping the status quo. And the pre or proactive, who says that things can get better in the future and we expect them to get better, so let's accelerate the rate in which we move into the future so we can take advantage of those opportunities. Then I'm going to show you a fourth type of planning which emerged as a result of systems thinking, which, using the concept of creativity I used earlier, violates a fundamental assumption common to all these three types of planning. So I can't show it on this chart because it disagrees with all of them with respect to a very critical assumption. Now, we can look at them graphically as follows. The reactive planner is standing in the present. He looks back to the past and he says, that was pretty good back there. I wish I were there. Let me get my marker. He picks a point in the past that he likes, and now he tries to go back to that through planning. Now we have a whole bunch of historical movements of exactly that type. You see what he does here is, having established where he wants to be, he elevates that to where he wants to be. Then this is his plan. It's a path from where he is now to where he once was. When the Industrial Revolution began in England, there was an immediate response by a group called the Luddites. How many of you are familiar with the Luddites? You know what they did? They armed themselves with pickaxes and explosives. They broke into factories and tried to destroy them because they wanted to go back to medieval guild production. They claimed that mechanization and industrialization was destroying the quality of life. Reactive, wanted to go back. In the French Revolution, Jean-Marc Rousseau led a revolution called the Back to Nature movement. He said people ought to desert the city, go back into the countryside, prance over the prairie, whistling Bach and reciting poetry. He had this idyllic nature of the good life, which was anti-urban and anti-industrial. In the 19th century, 1900s in England, William Morris and John Ruskin led a movement called the Gothic Revival. They actually built a village modeled after the Gothic village in which all the production was done by hand, and they produced some wonderful arts and crafts work there. But they argued that only in such a village could you capture an improved quality of life, going back to a previous time. In the United States, we ran into it in the 1960s in the hippie movement. In fact, there may be some of them here. There was a subgroup of hippies who went up to Western Canada in Victoria and opened up communes to live off the land by denying the use of any technology, by digging post holes with their hands, not using any fertilizers or any modern chemical products. They did not survive. But there is a wonderful record of them. The son of one of the cult heroes of the 60s, Mark Vonnegut, He had a son, Kurt Vonnegut had a son, Mark. And Mark went to one of these communes. He was unfortunately schizophrenic, but he survived it. Came back and wrote a better book than his father ever wrote. It's called Return from Eden, because his commune was called Eden after the Garden of Eden. And it's a marvelous record of these kids that hoped to create the kind of quality of life they thought existed when man was created, all going backwards to a previous state. You see, it's easy. The way they solve problems is easy. A problem arises, and the question is, what caused the problem? If you can find the cause of the problem and remove it, where will you be? You'd be back to where you were before the problem arose. And so that's the basic logic. Find the source of every difficulty, remove it, you'll be back to where you were before the difficulty arose. It doesn't work for a number of reasons, but it's easy to recognize this kind of organization. It's modeled after the oldest form of organization known to man, and the most stable. Now there's a challenge for you. What's the oldest and most stable organization known to man? Family, right. And so these companies aspire to be one great big happy family. The CEO is referred to as the old man, because he usually is. You see, the solutions to the problems lie in the past, therefore experience is the best teacher for reactive organizations. Who has the most experience? The old man. And so you have patriarchal and paternalistic organizations, hierarchical, with authority concentrated at the top because father knows best. That's the reactive organization. Now, the inactive organization says, look, things may not be perfect, but they're good enough. They're better than they used to be. Don't muck it up. Let well enough alone. Don't change it. So this is, generally speaking, the conservative movement politically, which is now the majority movement throughout the Western world. Don't change things fundamentally. Act only when you have to, and when you have to, do as little as you possibly can. Don't disturb things that are working. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's all inactive or conservative mottos. They do not plan, because planning is an effort to change things. And so they take the position of anti-planners. They use planning as an excuse for solving problems. I described to somebody during the break an experience I had recently with the mayor of Philadelphia. He called on me and said, I'd like you to be a member of a commission that I want to establish and produce a plan for Philadelphia for the next couple decades. He said, are you willing to serve? I said, well, when's the first meeting of the commission? He told me when. I said, I will come to the first meeting and decide there, but only if you will be there. He said, well, I hadn't planned to be there. I said, well, if it's not important enough for you, it sure as hell isn't for me. So he paused. He said, all right. He said, I'll be there. So he came. After the chairman opened the session, the chairman was the president of Hahnemann University. He called on me to make some remarks about the planning process. And I said, I have a question to the mayor, who was sitting immediately on my right. I said, Mr. Mayor, this is the 11th Planning Commission you have created in the last 5 years, and you have not disbanded any of the previous 10. Can you please tell us how this commission is supposed to differ from the previous 10? And he just mumbled and didn't say anything, and I got up and left. Planning commissions are simply a way of forestalling criticism externally, not for getting anything done. That's typically conservative people. As you know, our government's now being investigated by the FBI for lots of reasons, including something called corruption. The pre-active planner, this is the inactive planner, you see. He's standing on his head in the present because he wants to be where he already is. So there's no planning here. The pre-active is doing that. He forecasts what's going to happen. He says the future offers opportunities. And my plan has to be a strategy for exploiting the opportunities that changes that are predicted in the future are going to produce. This is the dominant mode of planning in the United States. I have gone through in the library with students the entire library on planning, which is hundreds of books. And over 95% of those books present pre-active planning, which is predict and prepare. Forecast the future and prepare to exploit the opportunities and to minimize the threats that it presents. It's a typical one. This type of planning ignores a fact which is revealed but highly concealed in our culture. Only 2% of the pre-active plans ever produced are implemented. Only 2%. 98% of them are never completely implemented. Do you know why? Because the forecasts on which they are based turn out to be wrong. There is no way of producing an accurate forecast for 5 years or 10 years out, except of trivial things. So I can forecast there will be people. That's pretty likely to be true, but it's not particularly useful. You can forecast what the age mix will probably be. So you can project, that's not forecasting. But the important forecasts turn out to be all wrong. 5 years ago, nobody was predicting you'd be able to take pictures with a handheld telephone. But that changed all kinds of things. People were not predicting the VCR or the DVD and so on. Those things all change our concept of the future and what's possible. Now, all three of these things have one property in common. That is, they all look at the current state, compare it with what they would like, and then plan to go from where we are out to where we want to be, whatever the direction is. And if it's where we already are, then you plan to stay where you are. Interactive planning, the fourth type of planning, denies that assumption, that planning is to get from where you are to where you want to be. It says planning ought to be getting from where you want to be to where you are. So you start by an idealized design, which is where we began today, to define where you want to be right now. The reason for that is if you don't know where you want to be right now, how the hell can you know where you want to be 5 years from now? The one thing you can be absolutely sure of is that 5 years from now, you're not going to want to be where today you say you're going to want to be 5 years from now. Can you remember what you wanted to be when you were 18 years old? And look at the differences between that and what you want today. Well, I can remember that very clearly because that's when I was studying architecture. And every architect wanted to live in Paris. You know, that's where all the great architects were, the great artists. The Impressionist movement was in its heyday. Paris was a dream, and then I got there. It very quickly lost those properties. It's a nice place to visit, but not the place I wanted to live. So as long as I wasn't there, I wanted to be there. But when I got there, that was not what I wanted. And that's what happens with most long-range forecasts. I also wanted to be an architect, and look how I got destroyed along the way. You keep changing all the time. So interactive planning starts with where do you want to be right now? That's the vision produced by idealized redesign. And now you plan backwards from there to here. Now that sounds absolutely arbitrary for the following reason. Repeat an argument that was given to me. Said to me, Russ, are you saying if I want to go from here, let's say Los Angeles to Chicago, and I want to find the shortest route, I ought to find the shortest route from Chicago back to Los Angeles? I say, yes, that's absolutely true. That doesn't make sense, he said. Suppose I'm in Chicago and want to go to Los Angeles. Are you telling me I ought to find the shortest route from Los Angeles back to Chicago? I said, yes. He said, but they may be different. I said, yes, they may be. He said, it doesn't make any sense. I said, I know. That's why it took until 1954 for Richard Beltman at the University of Southern California to discover that it's true. The principle is called dynamic programming. He showed that whenever you have a point of origin that's known and a point of destination that's known, And the problem is find the best way of getting from A to B. It's always best to work from B back to A. It will simplify the procedure by an order of magnitude. Now, there's a proof for this. He provided it. It involves functional analysis and set theory, and I'm not going to take you through all that stuff. I don't remember it anyhow. So let's just take a few simple examples. How many of you ever watch a tennis match? Most. Let's take Wimbledon. 64 players enter Wimbledon. How many matches will have to be played? Well, that's straightforward. If there's 64 players, how many first round matches? 32. How many second round matches? 16. How many third round matches? Then 4, 2, 1. Add them up. You can do it that way. The answer, by the way, is 63. Now suppose I start at the end of the tournament instead of the beginning. If there were 64 players that entered the tournament, how many losers did there have to be? No arithmetic. 63. Now that doesn't sound like a big advantage until I tell you 57 players entered the tournament. Now you got a problem. Because you have to arrange the first round so that the number of people left is a power of 2. And so you have to provide what are called buys. The highest ranking players are given exemption from the first round so you can get the results of the first round and give you a power of 2. But now if I tell you 57 players enter the tournament, how many matches will have to be played, and I start at the end, it doesn't make one damn bit of difference, does it? How many matches? 56 has to be. Because whatever the number of people entered, that number minus 1 is the number of matches, no matter how you arrange it. Now, why is all that so? By the way, the remarkable thing is, how many of you are familiar with children that like to work with mazes? Solve a maze. How do they work a maze? They learn very quickly. They don't know why, but they always go from the exit to the entrance, and they're absolutely right. It's always easier to go from the exit to the entrance. Now, why? When I was about 13 years old, I came home from school with a colleague one day. We sat on his living room floor doing our algebra homework. His brother, who was in high school and therefore omniscient, came in and looked at what we were doing. He said, "Algebra?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "You know that stuff?" We said, "Well, we think we do." He said, "All right, let's see how good you are." And here's the problem he gave us. The farmer's going to market with a bushel of apples. He gave his first friend half of his apples plus half an apple. So if I had 100 apples, I gave you 50 and 1/2 apples, right? But the second friend gave him half of the remaining apples plus half an apple. Third friend, same thing. Fourth friend, same thing, and I had none left. How many did I start with? Now that's a straight algebraic problem. Very simple, it's just long. You start off, he began with X apples. So how many did he give his first friend? 1/2 X plus 1/2, right? Therefore, the amount of apples he had when he met his second friend was X minus parentheses, 1/2 X plus 1/2 parentheses plus 1/2. So the amount he had left when he met his second friend was X minus parentheses this, and you finish you got an equation about 1 foot long. But it's simple. It's all just 1/2 and plus 1/2. We worked on it for about an hour and came up with a solution and showed it to the older brother, and he looked at it and he laughed. We said, "What's the matter? Is it wrong?" He said, "No, you got the right answer." We said, "Then what are you laughing at?" He said, "The stupid way you did it." "How can it be stupid if we got the right answer?" He said, "Look, stupid. How many apples did he had left when he met his fourth friend? Now remember, I gave her half of my remaining apples plus half an apple. How many did I have left when I reached her? 1. It's the only possible number, right? Half of 1 is 1/2, plus 1/2 is 1, and 1 from 1 is 0. So I had 1. Now I couldn't have had less than 2 when I reached him. Couldn't be 2, because half of 2 is 1, plus 1/2 is 1.5, and 1.5 from 2 is not 1. So by a marvelous leap of mathematical intuition, let's try 3. Half of 3 is 1 1/2, plus a half is 2, and lo and behold, 2 from 3 is 1, so I had 3. Can't be less than 6. Can't be 6 for the same reason. 3 plus a half is 3 1/2, and 3 1/2 from 6 is not 3, so you try 7. And lo and behold, half of 7 is 3 1/2, plus a half is 4, and 4 from 7 is 3. Now I don't even have to do the calculation for you, because all I do is multiply by 2 and add 1. I started with 15 apples. It takes me 1 minute to do it backwards, and an hour to do it frontwards. And we know why. How many values can x take on? Any positive integer. How many positive integers are there? Somebody said it. Say it out loud. How many positive integers? Infinite, right, infinite. When I started backwards, how many apples could I have when I reached her? 1. The difference between infinity and 1 is very large. And so you plan backwards, because the number of alternatives that you have to consider is significantly reduced. You simplify the project of planning by an order of magnitude by going backwards. Now, planning consists of 6 steps in interactive planning. First of all, it consists of designing the desirable present and finding or inventing the ways of approximating as closely as possible. It says you go into the future by making the present more desirable. You create the future by what you do now, for a very simple reason. The only place you can act is in now. You can't act in the future. You can only act now. And so it's what you do now with respect to where you are that's critical. Since design and invention are acts of creation, interactive planning is the act of creating the future by what you do at the present time. And so it consists of continuously closing the gap between where you are and where you want to be as you move in time. You continually try to bring yourself closer and closer to where you want to be, ideally. Now, the phases are, first, in conventional planning, it's called situational analysis. It's called formulating the mess. We have an interesting problem. A problem is an abstraction. Believe it or not, you have never experienced a problem, and you can't. Problems are not subject to experience. What you experience are events which are systems of problems. They are sets of problems that are interacting with each other. They're complex systems of interacting problems. You see, a problem is to reality what an atom is to a table. Now, anybody that's had an elementary course in physics knows the table consists of atoms, indivisible particle of matters. It's now not an atom, it's a parton and a quark, but that doesn't change things. It's an indivisible particle of matter. You don't see those things. You see the table. The atoms are abstractions extracted from the table by analysis. A problem is nothing you experience. It's the result of analyzing reality and extracting from it the elements of which it's made out of, and the element is a problem. Therefore, it turns out, since reality is a system of problems, what happens if you separate the problems that constitute the systems and treat them separately? You miss the essential properties of reality and the essential properties of the problems, because it's the interacting properties of the problems that are relevant, not the properties of the problems taken separately. So we need a whole new methodology. How do you deal with problems collectively instead of separately? And that's what formulating the mess is. Now, the procedure developed for doing this is really a surprising one with very unusual results. What you do is you make 2 false assumptions. The first false assumption is that the organization you're dealing with is going to continue doing what it's doing now without any change into the future. Okay? That's false, because if we were going to do that, you wouldn't be planning. The second false assumption is the expected future will occur. Now you project the present organization into the expected future, and you know what's going to happen. The organization will destroy itself. Why? You have assumed a non-changing organization. It's not adapting. But you have a changing environment. If you put a non-adaptive entity into a changing environment, it will ultimately destroy itself. So I don't have to go through this process to know that when I do it, I'm going to destroy the corporation. What I don't know is how. This process will tell me how the organization will destroy itself, and thereby it reveals the Achilles heel, the seeds of its own destruction in its current behavior is revealed by this process. So let's take a look. The dean of the Wharton School got in a fight with the president of the university and resigned in 1973 and left to become the president of the 4th District of the Federal Reserve Bank, headquartered in Cleveland, covering the state of Ohio, Kentucky, and western Pennsylvania. He was a close personal friend, so he called me and asked me to come out to Cleveland. In the Taj Mahal, they called the federal headquarters. He said, look around here and see if there's something we can do to improve the efficiency of this bank. I said, Willis, banking is your field, not mine. I don't know a damn thing about banks. I don't even know what the Federal Reserve Bank does. He said, oh, it's simple, Russ. He said, we control the flow of money. I said, no, you don't. He said, what do you mean we don't? I said, you mean to say you got people back there with spigots and they're turning knobs and money is flowing out of it? Is that what you're doing? He said, oh, no, I don't mean that. He said, the effect is the flow of money. But I didn't ask you what the effect was. I said, what are they doing? He said, I don't know. I said, well, why don't we find out? So we did a time study. 65% of the time in the Federal Reserve Bank is spent clearing checks. That's what the Federal Reserve Bank does, primarily, clears checks. By the way, the second largest consumer of time is the processing of money, taking out the old bills and putting out the new one. It got nothing to do with the money supply. So he said, how many checks do you clear a year? He said, well, we got a record of that. So we went back 20 years, and we plotted the number of checks cleared per year, and it was an exponential. Went up like this. We said, how many checks can a check clearer clear in a year, in the day? Well, first we had to learn how to say it. And we found out by plotting it that this had not changed in 20 years. The number of checks a check clearer could clear was a constant. So now we could calculate, going out from 73 to 85, how many check clearers would be needed in 1985 if the bank continued to clear checks in the way that it always had, and if the projection of expected number of checks was exactly a continuation of the past trends. And then an amazing thing happened. In 1985, you would need more check clearers than there were people in the United States. Now, you see, that can't happen. Believe it or not, it can't happen. No way. So something is going to prevent it from happening. What? You don't know. But that's the point. Because what will happen depends to a large extent on what you do. You have an effect on that critical event that will stop the inevitable from occurring, which can occur. But the question is, are you going to stop it or are you going to let somebody else do it? Is it going to happen to your benefit or against your benefit? Well, just to finish that particular story, the major problem of planning then was how to reduce the number of checks that have to be cleared so that we don't need to use the whole population of the United States clearing them. You can guess the answer because you're all familiar with it. We invented the electronic funds transfer system. And for the next 20 years consecutively, the number of checks per year kept going down. And in 1999, for the first time, the number of checks in the United States was less than the preceding year. So through electronic funds transfer, you prevented the destruction of the system by the way shown it would destroy itself if it continued. On the other hand, the same logic leads sometimes to humorous results. The National Science Foundation called an invitational conference to discuss a projection made by Della Sola Price, a leading historian of science at Yale University. He had projected the number of scientists in the Western world since the beginning of history, and it was an exponential curve. There are more scientists living today than have lived in the entire past history of man. So he continued the curve, and he showed that within 20 years, there would be more scientists than there were people. Now, this disturbed the National Science Foundation. What disturbed them is how the hell are they going to support them? So they called a meeting to discuss this. Now, Waterman, who was the head of the National Science Foundation, was an old friend of mine. So we went through a day in which I said nothing. I just listened to this conversation between these eminent people. In the middle of the second day, there was a lull, and Waterman turned to me. He said, "Russ," he said, "I've never heard you go through a day and a half without saying anything before. What in the world is bothering you?" I said, "This is all nonsense." "What do you mean it's nonsense? This is a serious discussion." I said, "No, it isn't." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You're discussing a meaningless question." "Why?" I said, "Well, let's go back to Newton's time, 18th century. Define a mathematician at the time of Newton." Well, how would you define it? Somebody who knew how to do algebra, who had learned the differential calculus, didn't know integral calculus, didn't know anything about set theory or functional analysis. I said, today every graduate from intermediate school is a mathematician by Newton's definition. Because they can all, any kid coming out of high school knows more mathematics today than Newton knew. So you can say there are more mathematicians today than there are people. So you ignore the fact that the meaning of the word changes over time. What the average high school student knows about science today is more than the scientists of 100 years ago knew. So this projection is nonsense. 100 years from now, the average high school student will know a hell of a lot more science than the average person who will know everything that we know now and more. So you've got to be careful when you project these things, that you're dealing with terms whose meaning does not change over time. This kind of projection has been made for any number of organizations, and believe it or not, you always find some way they're going to destroy themselves by something that will happen unless they change, and then that focuses your attention in the planning process. Now, the second step of the planning process is ends planning, where you design the idealized present, this is the idealized redesign, and identify the gaps between that and where you are presently. Then the means planning, inventing the policies, programs, practices, and courses of action required to get you to the objectives. Resource planning is very critical because it's virtually never done. Almost every company does what's called capital planning. But there are 5 types of resources, not just capital. They're listed here. There's people, facilities and equipment, materials, supplies and services, and money and information. Resource planning has to deal with all 5 of them. It very seldom does. Money is almost always not the most important resource. People are usually the most important one. Drucker and others have pointed out, there is no competence that a corporation has that it can't exploit profitably. All unprofitable action results from the lack of the competence to do it profitably. So it's people that are the critical thing. But this function of resource planning has a very interesting feedback role in the planning process. For example, in the first corporate plan that was produced for Anheuser-Busch, one of the results was to build a new brewery that was going to be more than twice as large as the largest brewery which had ever been built, which at that time was St. Louis, Missouri. That required a capital appropriation of hundreds of millions of dollars from the board. When the planning group doing this, consisting of executives, came into course that result, they said, "Russ, you present this to the board." Why? So the board's going to go mad when they see this thing. So I said, all right, the board can't fire me. So I appeared at the board, of which August Busch Jr., who died subsequently, was CEO. This is the old man Busch that used to ride around the St. Louis Cardinals Stadium driving the Clydesdale horses. The little guy with a Napoleonic complex. He almost walked around like this, but not quite. But he had a defect in his throat and had a gravel voice, which was very characteristic. So after I'd been presenting the argument for the new brewery about 5 or 10 minutes, he said, "Doc, cut it out," he said. I said, "What do you mean, Mr. Bush?" He said, "You're wasting our time." And I was a little bit surprised by this. I said, "What do you mean I'm wasting your time, Mr. Bush?" He said, "We can't build that brewery." He said, "There's no way that we can get the money required to build that brewery." I said, "Mr. Bush, it's easy for you to get that money. You have the second lowest debt-to-debt equity ratio in the United States. The only company in the United States that has less debt than you do is DuPont. You have enough unused credit to build 3 of those breweries." He said, "No, we don't." I said, "I don't understand." He said, "I know you don't, so let me explain it to you." He said, "When Prohibition was enacted, I knew that it wouldn't last. Eventually, it would have to be repealed. So I was the only brewery in the United States that did not close. Instead, we started to produce a soft drink called Bevo. We produced baker's yeast. We produced molasses. We produced a number of different things to keep the people employed. We fired nobody during Prohibition, and we lost money every year because we're not equipped to make those kinds of things. We're equipped to make beer." He said about halfway through Prohibition, we were running out of funds. We'd used all of our reserve capital. So I went to the banks and asked them to lend me money to get me through Prohibition, and they refused. They said I was a bad investment. He said, out of desperation, I then went to 17 branches of the Anheuser and the Busch family and got them to put up their personal fortunes. And I got enough money to keep going until Prohibition was repealed. He said, when it was repealed, we were the first brewery back in operations. And he smiled. He said, we made it all back in 6 months. While the others were getting ready, we were out there pouring the beer into the market. He said, how do you think I'm going to allow those goddamn banks to make any money off this company? So I'll tell you what. He said, I believe that's the right brewery to build, but I'm not going to borrow money to build it. If you can generate more cash flow so we can build that brewery out of cash flow, I'll build it. So I said, well, we'll try. So he dismissed us and we went off to try. By God, we found a way of doing it by changing the production process. Came back to the board, showed him the additional capital, all that was required for the new brewery, plus a surplus of $10 million, which was trivial. He said, great. They authorized the brewery. He said, what are we going to do with that extra $10 million? We said, well, it's a good time to start diversifying. He said, that's a good idea. He said, how should we diversify? We said, we don't know. He said, well, go find out. So I went back to the planning table. He came back to the board a couple months later with 3 alternatives, each one using the $10 million that was surplus. The board looked at it and said, we want to do all 3. We said, you don't have enough money. They said, go find it. Now, that was the beginning of a process that never ended. See, one of the great fictions of industry is the budget. What a nonsense that is. That's evaluating reality against the forecast. You ought to be evaluating forecasts against reality, not the other way around. A budget ought to be a dynamic instrument for control of expenditures and income, not something fixed and concrete against which you evaluate what really happens. That's nonsense. So that you need flexibility there. And in effective planning, you have constant feedback from the various stages of planning so that you're constantly revising it. And so developed the slogan that I mentioned earlier, and planning process is the most important product. The plans are not. August Bush was making a presentation to the security analysts in New York at one point. One of them said, Mr. Bush, you ever do corporate planning? He said, yes. We've been doing it since the middle 60s. He said, could we see one of them? And Bush said, no. The analyst said, what's the matter? Are you ashamed of it? He said, no. He said, then is it secret? He said, no. Then why won't you let us see it? He said, because we don't have one. Wait a minute, said the analyst. You've now told us you've been corporate planning for more than a decade, and you don't have a plan. He said, right. He said, I don't understand. And Bush said, I know you don't understand, because you have the wrong conception of planning. He said, planning is a motion picture. A plan is a still photograph taken out of the picture. You don't evaluate a motion picture by a still photograph taken out of it. He said, I have a planning room in which all the documents giving the current status of planning are there. I can go in there at any time and find out what the current status of planning is. But there are clerks in there constantly updating the documents. Planning is a continuous process. The plan is a fiction, but not planning. And so resource planning is one of the dynamics that makes feedback continuous. When you find out income isn't what you expect it to be, nor are expenditures, you constantly adjust to take it into account. Then you design the implementation, who is to do what, where, and when, and by when are they supposed to accomplish it. Then finally, the design of controls, continuous checking of the assumptions and expectations associated with implementation of plans. This is the checking to find the mistakes and correct them so that you improve in your planning process continuously. That's another feedback source for the continuation of planning. Okay. I don't know what's happening here. I hit the wrong button. We had that. We had that. And we're back to the beginning. That's it. So I'd like to use the remaining time we have, which is about 25 minutes, for any additional questions that we've generated by the discussion this afternoon. Doesn't have to be questions. They can be issues. You want to argue or fight, that's fine. I dare you.
U.S.'s aerospace plan and vision, what's your opinion of it? And what could companies like Rocket, and what do you suggest for us to do to our management or to our employees?
Well, I don't know what your vision is. All I know about Boeing is I know what your next airplane is. You hope it will be the 777s. I've done some work on that, but I've never seen a corporate plan, so I don't know what your vision.
I meant President Bush's vision.
Well, that's. I'm sorry. What
President Bush has recently announced the vision for America's space program.
Oh, that Bush. I thought you were talking about Anheuser-Busch. I couldn't.
Come on now.
You're talking about the unimportant Bush. I don't think he has a vision. I think he's operating opportunistically and responding to situations as they arise. He clearly did not have a plan for after the invasion of Iraq, and he got caught completely unaware. He'd been misled by the expatriates from Iraq as to what to expect. And he was building that on a vision of what happened in the occupation of Japan. I was in the army that occupied Japan, and I landed with the first troops in Yokohama. And the Japanese were on the docks with bands playing the Star-Spangled Banner, waving the American flag. That literally happened when we landed in Japan. He thought that was going to happen in Iraq, and it didn't. So I don't know that he's got a plan. If he does, I'm certainly not privy to it. I only know what I can read in the newspapers. But I do know it's a hell of a mess, and it's not going to get any better doing what we're doing now. I don't see any end to the current conflict. I think we're there indefinitely, unless there's a fundamental change in our strategy. Okay?
One of the basic ideas I think that you presented today, at least that was interesting to me, was the concept of development versus growth in the corporate enterprise. Could you maybe discuss a little bit more of how you see that concept evolving relative to not only the domestic economy, but a world economy that's almost based upon the notion of growth in our financial institutions?
The best way to answer your question is to look at organizations that have done it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with SAS, not the airlines, but the software company in North Carolina. Any of you know that? There's a company that's done it. It's incredible what that company's done. They were the subject of 60 Minutes a couple months ago. They devote themselves to the following commitment to all their employees. If and when you leave this company voluntarily, you will be in a better position to get a job than you were when you came to work here. We will increase your employability while you are here. That's a commitment. That's a developmental commitment. At IBM today, every employee is supposed to spend 20% of their time in learning. One day out of the week is supposed to be devoted to learning only. These are evidence of various types of commitment to the process of development. Now, when it comes to the global thing, there are very few globally operating corporations that are committed to development. They primarily go abroad to grow in their home area. It's to expand their existing business, not to develop the country they move into. I know of only one exception to that. That's a company called Tremec in Mexico, which builds parts for trucks for Ford, General Motors, and so on. And they are committed to the development of the regions in which they have plants. They're primarily in Querétaro in Mexico. And they've done a very considerable job of it. So there's not much commitment by a part of corporations for development. There's not much for government. I had a wonderfully negative experience in India. I was in India, this is a long time ago, 57. And we had just announced that we were going to mothball the Mariner fleet of boats. This was the ships that we used during World War II to ship war supplies over to Europe, Africa, and to Asia. And they were out of date, so we're going to mothball them. India offered to buy them, and we refused to sell it to them. Although India promised it would use these boats only for intercoastal shipping around their very extensive coast. We said, no, you won't. You use it for transatlantic and trans-Pacific shipping. You'll come in competition with us, and we're not going to finance your competing with us. So we wouldn't sell them the ships. But, we said, we will sell you our surplus of butter at a very low cost. Now, I was in India when this happened, and I never heard people laugh so hard. First of all, the Indians don't use butter. They use ghee. Secondly, they didn't have refrigeration, so they couldn't keep it even if they had it. And so they laughed about the United States. They said, the United States is willing to give us anything that will solve its problems. They said, that's the difference between the United States and Russia. Russia comes here to find out what we need and offers it to us. They give us 1/3 as much as the United States, but they give us what we need, not what they need to get rid of. Now, we don't have a policy like that. When I came back from India, I met with the State Department to discuss this characteristic of our aid. But all of our aid has this orientation. What will it do for us? Not primarily what will it do for them. So we've got to change that orientation. We are a very self-centered organization as a state. Other question? Yeah.
Yeah, when you talk about changing organizations, how well does it work? I know you're working at the top. How well does it work? But you say it has to come from the bottom too. How well does it work to change a piece of the bottom and just have that sit
Good.
there? And how does that fit in on the rest?
Works wonderfully. I'll give you an example. In Alcoa, Tennessee, which is the largest Alcoa operation, they have 3 plants that are more than a mile long where they produce sheet aluminum. It's used for the skin of airplanes primarily, but it's also used for Venetian blinds. Today, the major use is beverage containers. This system was organized at the very top and the very bottom, nothing in the middle for technical reasons. It was done with the union, Local 309, the United Steelworkers Union. So the first real application occurred with the hourly paid workers. Now, I want to describe one thing that happened. Shortly after the system was introduced, we created a board for the foreman. 2 men at the end of one production line made a change that saved the company $1.25 million a year net. And the company was excited about this. I heard about this when I came to visit, one of my regular visits. So I went down to the plant to meet these two men and congratulate them. They were men in their 50s who had gone to work for Alcoa at about 20 years earlier, 25 years earlier, right out of high school. They had been working there all that time continuously because Alcoa paid twice as much to an hourly paid worker as the second highest compensator for hourly paid employers in Tennessee, which happened to be Roman Haas. So they were grateful for the pay, but they hated the company. But they made this change, which saved $1.25 million. Now, the nature of the change is not critical. It made a slight change in the way you handle the rolls of sheet aluminum coming off the end of the production line. I went down and congratulated them, and they were proud as punch. They were just full of pride. When they were at their peak of their puffery, I said, I'm curious, how long have you known about this? They both looked down, they wouldn't answer me. And I kept pressing. And finally, one of them mumbled, 15 years. I said, oh my God, you mean to say you've known about this potential improvement for 15 years and you haven't done anything about it? They said, yeah. I said, how come? I'll never forget their answer. Those sons of bitches never asked me before. To assume they don't know enough, you see. I had another similar experience at General Motors. A man came into a dealer and bought the most expensive Cadillac made. They prepped it for him. He came and picked it up and drove it out. And about 2 blocks out of the dealership, they were readying a road for paving. You know how they scrape the road to produce ridges in it so the concrete will bind? When he drove across that ribbed road, the car rattled. He turned around and came right back to the dealer. He said, look, I just bought the most expensive Cadillac you have. I didn't buy a rattle. Get the goddamn rattle out. The dealer apologized all over the place, called the service manager. He said, this man says his car has a rattle. Take it back, work it over, turn to the man who bought the car, said, I'll give you a loaner, come back tomorrow and your car will be ready. He came back the next day, got the car, drove it out, hit the stretch of road, and it rattled. He turned around and came back and he was furious. He said, I want a new Cadillac or my money back, right now. The dealer said, just a minute. Called the service manager. He said, did you really check this car? He said, we did. We put it up on a rack. We had everybody look at the car. There are no loose parts on the car. It cannot rattle. The manager said, you take it out for a road test? He said, no. He said, you take it out right now. He said, why? There's nothing loose. He said, take it out. So the reluctant service manager took it out, hit that stretch of road, and it rattled. He brought it back red-faced. He said, it rattles. There's something loose in the well of the driver's side door. You know, there's a well that the window goes down into. Something is in there that's rattling. You can't see it. So, of course, we couldn't see it when it was up on a deck. He said, give me a couple minutes. I'll take it back, take the door off, and open it up and find out what it is. The owner agreed. He went back. Didn't take long to take the door off. He opened it up, and there was a Coke bottle on the bottom. That's what was rattling. Inside the Coke bottle was a piece of paper. So out of curiosity, they pulled a piece of paper out, and this is what it said. So you finally found it, you rich son of a bitch. Now, you see, there are a couple things to learn about this. If you're not using all that they know, they will resent your employment like hell, and they're going to get even with you for doing it. This is one of the reasons that 67% of the quality programs are failures, because they focus on the quality of output, not the quality of work. If you have a high quality of work, you'll get a high quality of product no matter what you do. If you have a low quality of work, you can have all the goddamn histograms and computers you want, you're not going to get decent quality. You can have 26 Sigma, and it's not going to make any difference with a bad quality of work. So we focus on the wrong thing. Quality is important, but where do you enter the system to get the best quality? Now, you were asking about the bottom. There's a case where we entered at the hourly paid worker level. That plant, which was the least productive aluminum plant in the world, is today the most productive aluminum plant in the world by a factor of 3 to 1. The company has since spent $500 million on modernizing that plant, and it's 3 times as productive as the second most productive plant in the world. And the only thing that was changed originally was the nature of the relationship between manager and subordinate. By the way, it moved from the top and bottom down and up until it met in the middle. It took about 2 years to go through that process. Yeah.
In this changing era that you mentioned earlier, I'd be interested in your comments about the overseas jobs that are being created,
Yeah.
i.e.
Good question.
the receptionists and the bill pay,
Sure.
that kind of thing.
I'm giving you a personal opinion now. I think NAFTA, I haven't been giving you any up to now. I think NAFTA is a great thing, and the shipping of jobs overseas is a great thing, because I believe the most critical single problem in the world is the maldistribution of wealth. And the shipping of jobs overseas is a way of slightly affecting the distribution of wealth. Not nearly as much as I would like, but it's doing that. The problem is that we are not creating new jobs to replace the ones that are shipped overseas. That's our fault, not theirs. If instead of giving this tax reduction, which I think is nonsense, we invested in improving the infrastructure of cities in the United States, we'd be getting a return in productivity and create the jobs that are necessary. In effect, what I'm saying is we need a WPA. You remember that in World War II, the Works Progress Administration that Roosevelt started to solve the unemployment problem, and it did. He created parks, he created Yellowstone and the other major parks, he created city urban areas, he cleaned up slums and did all that kind of stuff, which needs to be done. And we ought to be spending money on doing that. Our sewage system and water systems are becoming archaic. They're breaking all the time. We had a gas main break in Philadelphia the other day, which killed some 40 people, and stuff like that is going on all the time. We ought to be creating jobs to replace the ones that are going overseas. And we're not. We're just leaving those people on their own. So my feeling is we ought not to stop shipping jobs abroad, but we ought to start creating jobs here. Yeah.
You're talking about future planning is dynamic, coming, changing. So how you feel about Mr. Greenpan used today economy deficit and Chinese take action for the 10 years from now on the security issue?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Can you tell me?
My question is, when you're talking about planning in the future, should we depend on dynamic changing, coming?
I'm saying you want to plan without forecasting.
Yeah, not forecasting.
I didn't say you plan without the future. You plan without forecasting. Now you've got to be creative. How can I take the future into account without forecasting it?
Okay,
How? Well, let me answer the question before. Okay. By making assumptions about it. You see, assumptions about the future are entirely different than forecasts. For example, you have an automobile, you carry a spare tire. You do, don't you? You have a spare tire. Is that because you forecast you're going to have a flat tire the next time you go out? You're shaking your head. You do? Of course you don't. If you forecast you're going to have a flat tire the next time, you wouldn't dress the way you're dressed now. You forecast you're not going to have one. But why do you carry a spare tire? Because you assume one is possible. The difference is that forecasts are about probabilities and assumptions are about possibilities. And when you identify what's possible and plan for them, you go through what's called contingency planning. You have a plan to cover any eventuality. When you forecast, you plan for one possible future instead of the range of possible futures. And you're doing it under conditions when you know your forecast is going to be wrong. When we invaded the Philippines during World War II, we had 7 different plans of invasion. We had to pick one for the invasion. Within 2 hours after we landed on A-Day, we knew we were wrong. If at that point we had to replan that invasion, we wouldn't be here today. But one of the other plans was appropriate. It was immediately pulled out. Word went out, immediately shift from plan A to plan Z. So contingency planning can take care of the future by dealing with assumptions about the future, not forecasts. Now, go ahead. What's your question?
In that sense, I want to ask in your opinion about recently Mr. Greenpan
straight projection out. And he says, therefore, Social Security is going to run out of money. So either you're going to have to increase the input to Social Security or decrease the output. That's what he said. Now, all the commentators, they've been interesting. They said Greenspan is being crucified because he told the truth. And that's true. He told the absolute truth. However, it's not necessary to decrease Social Security. There are other ways of preserving Social Security. For example, I discovered when I retired I could not turn it down. I don't need Social Security. I got enough income without it. So I wrote to Social Security and said, forget about it. And they wrote back and said, you can't. You have to take it. Did you know that? You do.
Yeah.
So whether I need it or not, I got to take it. Now, I got a simple solution. All the people that have an income over what you've said it wherever you want, $50,000 a year. If your retirement income is $50,000 a year or more, you don't get Social Security. That will be plenty to take care of the system. And it's not needed. It really isn't. It's incremental. Okay. Well, we got time for a couple more. Yeah. I can't hear you.
Did you share this idea with the power?
Uh-oh. Yeah, that doesn't do any good. Trying to be rational with politicians, you know, absolutely incredible. You ever hear a politician answer a question they were asked? They always answer the question they wish you had asked. Yeah.
Going back to your example, creation of jobs and your example of WPA. You're not saying that it's the government's responsibility to make up for the loss of jobs that are created by these corporate organizations, are you?
Yeah, I'm saying the government doesn't have to be looking at corporations, it has to be looking at the unemployed and saying there's a bunch of potentially useful labor. What needs to be done that that labor could be applied to? Now, who should pay for it? Is a question. It may be the city, it could be the state, it could be the federal government, it might be a tax on people. When we want to increase education in the area in which I lived in, we increased the taxes on property. That was one way of doing it. So there are alternative ways of doing it, but the task is to take the people who are unemployed and put them in the constructive work that will improve the quality of life and the standard of living of the community.
Rather than the organization, the corporate organizations who created the job loss, retraining?
Oh, no, I would tax downsizing or shipping jobs overseas. I wouldn't tax it by much, but I'd tax it enough so they'd have to think twice about doing it.
Do you consider, I'm concerned, I'm next asking a question, do you consider the shipping jobs overseas a threat to this country?
No. I think the failure to create jobs here is a threat to the country, but not shipping jobs overseas. Because if we don't ship them overseas, we're going to have a lot more Iraqs all over the world. Because it's the maldistribution of wealth around the world. Look at Africa, with over 30,000 children dying every night out of malnutrition. You know, we live with that. We don't talk about it. By not talking about it, we ignore it and think it'll go away. And here we sit with about 5% of the population of the world consuming over 60% of its resources. We're unwilling to take on the problem of the world that we're trying to conquer. What we're trying to do is use it, and everybody else sees us as doing that. They don't see us as being a benefactor, so we're surprised. Iraq doesn't look at us as a liberator, but as an occupier. Mm-hmm. We haven't given any evidence of being anything other than that. Now, any other? We'll take one last question. Yeah.
What changes do you see need to happen in the financial market, specifically the stock market, how that really pushes down on corporations saying, meet your numbers, what did you do last quarter, you didn't meet your numbers, your revenue's down, your profit's down, which then causes the company to react instead of...
I really can't answer your question because I don't worry about the stock market. I think anybody who does deserves it, so... I mean, that's one way to play with your money, and if you want to, that's okay with me, but that's not what I happen to be interested in, so I don't want to regulate it. It's like gambling, you know. If you want to gamble, that's as good a way to gamble as any. If you don't want to gamble, there are plenty of secure ways, or relatively secure ways of investing your money. Yeah.
I lead a company that's been trying to implement what you lay out in the book for the last 3 years. Where can I go to get help?
Help?
Yeah. Are there, other than this organization, which has been kind enough to let us in, are there other organizations
Yes.
that you're involved with that I can...
Well, there's some of my own, but there are also other organizations as well. Most of them are ones that are organized by former students or colleagues of mine, but there are a number of them. Where are you located? Here on the West Coast?
Yeah, Santa Clarita.
All right, you go to University of Southern California and talk to Professor Ian Mitroff, M-I-T-R-O-F-F. That's a place to start. Yeah.
As we move forward into transformations to try to take, say, an organization into being a multidimensional organization, what kind of leadership skills are necessary? Are they different than what we currently have?
Boy, effective persuaders and educators. It's any change in structure always meets tremendous resistance. Everybody, what's going to happen to me? You know, that's the prime concern when you start to talk about it. Not what's good about this, but how's it going to affect me? Is the way managers react when you make this proposal. So it takes a guarantee of security to get this thing to be given serious consideration. So when North Coast Energy began this process, the CEO, Gordon Yannell, told his vice presidents, no matter what we come out with, each of you will have a job, your compensation will not go down, but I can't tell you what your title or role will be. But I guarantee that you will not lose in any significant way. And they engaged. But I've been in other corporations where the defensiveness of vice presidents is incredible. You're going to destroy my job? And so they oppose everything because they see it as a threat on their job. So you've got to have some kind of guarantee. Sometimes it's ridiculous. When Imperial Oil in Canada bought Texaco, see, Texaco was much smaller than Esso in Canada, but Texaco was making money and Esso wasn't. So Texaco management was much better than Exxon's was in Canada. How in the world do they get the management to agree? Well, the purchasing contract was ludicrous. They guaranteed all managers of Texaco a tenure in the combined corporation of at least 2 years. Okay? What do you think happened at the end of 2 years? They all were let go in one fell sweep. Boy, that teaches a lot of people a lot of lessons. Don't monkey around with organization because sooner or later they're going to get you. Acquisition is seen generally as a device for downsizing, not as a device for creating employment, which it should be. Okay. See, the only reason to acquire a company that's legitimate is that you're going to increase its value, not you're going to decrease it. Yeah, that's the last one. Yep.
Do you have an assumption in that the management vice presidents are saying there that the vice presidents are necessarily leaders? I mean, maybe they're managers, and don't you want leaders? So then do you just give them that? You can't keep them in the same.
You don't want a company with all the vice presidents serving as leaders. You need managers, you need administrators, but you also need leaders. There's a need for each of them. One isn't better than the other. There are different requirements that are needed. So if you have nothing but leaders, you're not going to have anybody managing the operation.
All right.
Okay?
So you can keep their positions and their pay and their power.
You see, a wonderful example is Macintosh. Wozniak and Job were incredible leaders. They couldn't manage a goddamn thing. And it wasn't until they got Scully from Pensacola to come over that they began to organize a company that could survive. They lacked management. They didn't lack leadership. Then management couldn't keep them growing, so what did they do? Remember, they brought the job back. Okay, so I'm sorry if I gave the impression you want everybody to be a leader. You don't. What you do want is the people who have a natural talent for leadership to emerge and given the opportunity to lead. There aren't enough people that have that talent. You have to worry about a surplus. Okay?